I'm going to talk about death. It's an interesting topic, and I'll tell you how I came to be speaking about it. There's an organization in Brooklyn called the Morbid Anatomy Museum. I don't know if any of you have been there or seen it, but they're great. I really love them. It's a speaking space and a gallery space and a wonderful arcane library. And there were a few talks there that came to my attention that I really wanted to see. And so I loved the space. I went down there. I met the people. They were very nice. And of course, I do a lot of public speaking. I went on psychedelics. And I thought, well, this is a great place. This is a place I want to speak too. But, you know, it's kind of tricky because you don't want to speak too morbid when you're speaking about psychedelics. You know, you want people to have a difficult time. So, but as I thought about it, I realized there was enough things about where death and psychedelics topically kind of overlapped, like ego death, for example, or death and rebirth, different topics, where I figured I could put something together and speak to the Morbid Anatomy Museum. So I proposed something and they accepted. And as I was putting together the PowerPoint, I realized that all of these different things that kind of overlapped with psychedelics were really kind of pointing to the same thing. And it really inspired me because it became the focus of the talk. So I'm not going to tell you what the thing is up front, but I hope that by the end of the talk, you'll agree with me that there's kind of one dynamic here that's happening with psychedelics and death. Great. So here's what I want to do today. I want to just talk a little bit about the process of life. I'll talk about that really a little bit more later. And then start with the ancient view of death and visionary plants, death and psychedelics, because it's different from ours. And in a way presages what our view is coming toward. And then I want to talk about the modern perspective on growth and transformation on psychedelics. About stage theory, Piaget, and about a little bit about the psychedelics research. I won't talk about that much because it's been spoken about here a lot this weekend. And then more generally about ego death and the importance of the concept, and especially in the psychedelics research, the importance of ego death, peak experience. And then more generally about death and rebirth, and then some implications. So first, the ancient view. Isn't this a wonderful image? I've so wanted to use this in one of my talks for such a long time. And it's a great, I guess it's a woodblock print from the medieval days, really. It's not really tribal or ancient, but it shows you somebody kind of sticking their head through the known world, through the veil of the heavens, and peeking into the heaven, seeing what I like to think of as, I don't know, there's so many words for it, but let's call it maybe the netherworld. You know, this sort of subterranean Hades world that in mythology we could go to that wasn't really like the cessation of life, but was like a separate realm. And kind of as valid, you could go back and forth between them. In the southern communities, in the Amazon, this idea of good and evil being, like we have here in the West and the North, the idea of good being the transcendent thing we're all going for and the underlying thing that is the essence of everything, and evil kind of like being like an aberrant thing, like the angel fell off the ship and, it's kind of got us to deal with that. But the fundamental thing is good. And down in the Amazon, as I understand it, it's much more mixed. As Jimi Hendrix said, good and evil laying side by side. This is another world that in some ways is more real, a more real world. You go there to see, who stole your bracelet, or if your spouse is cheating on you down in the Amazon. Or you go there to touch reality, a deeper sense of truth or self or perfection. Seems almost more real than this. When we take a psychedelic trip, we gain insights, we remember things. And then we come back and try to apply it here in this world and to remember it. So it kind of reminds me of what I think of as the quantum mechanical world, the substrate world, the underlying world, out of which all the material world kind of like precipitates. And then the precipitate world, the concrete world. Precipitation is a great term. It's sort of like, you have a cloud, a vapor cloud of water vapor, and then conditions change. Maybe pressure changes or temperature changes, and then a raindrop congeals out of that. And it's a change of phase. a change of phase from gaseous to liquid, and it congeals and then falls to the ground as precipitation. So this world here, I think of as kind of like a precipitate world that falls out of, cools out of perhaps, the background substrate world, which both quantum mechanics and the tribal worldview both refer to. This more real world, if you will. So why do we need to do this? I mean, why do we need to drop back into this nether world to recharge, not recharge our batteries exactly, but retouch the spiritual perfection, that we all want to keep, that we want to inform our lives in this precipitate world? And I think of it like as sort of like a devil's bargain. Like that, I mentioned the frontal lobes. That's where the analytical, kind of categorical, sort of most advanced primate-style brain is. And then, so you have sort of like a triad of the frontal lobes and the vision, the visual acuity, and the fingers, the opposable thumb, the ability to manipulate the physical world. And those three things, the ability to see it, categorize it, and figure it out, and then do it, work on it, change the world. Why? It's adaptive. We survive longer. So here we are. We have food, shelter, clothing. We have roofs over our head. We have electricity and running water and all this wonderful stuff. But of course, we're alienated from nature. But that's the deal. You start out kind of thinking of it as a spiral metaphor. You start out down on the ground part, integrated into nature in a tribal setting, but healthy, spiritually healthy, not really needing perhaps to go visit the netherworld. But then, you die at 30 of an infection. So we adapt, and we create this marvelous triad, and we create civilization. We come 180 degrees around. Polar opposites, halfway up the circuit, living to 86 and alienated from nature. So of course, our purpose here is not to come back down, like Bin Laden or Kaczynski, the Unabomber, would have had us do, but go forward, power through this sort of Cartesian split into physical modernity and go through into a new integration, a neo-tribalism, if you will. So that's our long-term perspective, our long-term trajectory. But right now, we've got a sort of a devil's bargain. We're living longer, but we're alienated from our world. So even the tribal peoples, 10,000 years ago, the same brain, same size brain, same sophistication, same intelligence, and had to make that bargain as well. And so you see plant-based rituals in tribal settings as well. So this is ways to get there. This is why go there. And this is ways to get there. So visionary plants and admixtures. Ayahuasca is, of course, the vine of death, another reference to death. And it's death not in the sense of killing you, but death in the sense of transformation, a different view of death in the netherworld. It's funny that when ayahuasca is an admixture of two plants, one contains DMT and one contains another substance which makes the DMT orally active, because normally there's an enzyme in your gut that breaks down the DMT, the active principle in ayahuasca. But the second plant keeps it active and makes it orally active. So, but you think about it, in the tribal pharmacopoeia, in the jungle, with hundreds of thousands, if not more, plants, and then millions of combinations of the way they can be combined, not just substances, but in the way they're prepared, boiled, scraped, root, leaf, etc. And you ask the tribal peoples, well, how did you ever know that this plant contained the DMT and this plant would make it orally active? And they say, the mushrooms told us. Now, I tell that story, I love that statement. After a while, I started taking it seriously because, like I say, 10,000, 20,000 years ago, tribal environments, the brain is the same, the sophistication is the same. These people are not primitive. So why would they be saying some kind of fairy tale thing, like the mushrooms told us, like a cartoon sort of explanation, when they're every bit as intellectual and sophisticated as we are? And the answer is, of course, that's not what they're doing. It's a very real description of what happens in that world. So I, as a Westerner, as a Northerner, trying to figure out, how I can take that wisdom as truth and incorporate it into my own, sort of more mechanistic or scientific worldview, I realized here I am talking about spirituality, talking about the intersection between, the animal existence that I have and the spiritual experiences I have, and trying to make them both real. And I realized that I need to take what the tribal people say seriously. How then, in a thought experiment, would it be true that the mushrooms told them? And I think the answer is, in a broader sense, maybe in the way we think of it, in the words we might use, in a sort of a diffuse energy field, all scientific now, right? In a diffuse energy field, there's lots of knowledge, lots of energy, lots of information that can be absorbed when you're fully aware of, fully awakened to the energy field that we all reside within. So that's kind of the way that I make truth of the mushrooms told us. So, of course, there's other substances. LSD is a lysergide. It's synthetic, but there are naturally occurring lysergides. LSA, for example, lysergic acid amide, usually actually less powerful, with maybe more side effects. But lysergides have been used, in ancient times. The mystery traditions I mentioned specifically because the mystery traditions were the last way publicly in the West that there was psychedelic or visionary plants incorporated into cosmology and spiritual tradition, really, spiritual practice. And those were shut down in the first centuries AD by the oncoming Christian advance. But those mystery traditions, like the Oracle at Delphi or the Eleusinian mysteries, where scholarship deduces that there was a substance called the Kakian, which contained a lysergide made from ergot. So there was lots of ways to do it. But back then, right, in the first centuries AD, we sort of made this devil's bargain to separate, to have like, Descartes wasn't born yet, but it was like a Cartesian split between spirit and matter, between God and humans. And so you can sort of tip your hat to the spiritual world on Sundays, but the rest of the week you can go out and sort of try to extract out the active ingredient, the power from nature, to dominate nature, to make a mechanistic approach to life. And of course that's turned out to not work because we're now experiencing the perfect storm of global warming and topsoil depletion and water depletion. So the mechanistic approach, the separate approach, where spirit is sort of relegated to something else, and the mechanistic approach to the environment is okay, that approach is not working. And that's why I say we're coming back from our sort of industrial ways. More ways to get there. So you don't need drugs. Okay, so rhythm, there's different categories. So rhythmic, like rocking back and forth, like maybe sick people do, or in a mental hospital, babies who are cold or lonely or sad or want mommy, rocking back and forth. The idea of drumming and chanting, dancing, creating an alternate state, an altered state of consciousness. And the point here is, again, noticing your altered state. Noticing that you have a default state to be in an altered state from. Noticing that there's more than one state of consciousness. And so all of these are techniques for doing that. Drugs do them perhaps more reliably in some ways, but dissociation is another way. Sensory overload and sensory deprivation. Now there's a clue for you that it's not so much the reduction of the sensation or the presence of it, the overload, but the difference between the normal level of sensation, sensory overload and sensory deprivation. Mortification of the flesh, like that little girl who's got a spear through her cheeks. The charisms of the saints. Entheogens is one of them, where they claim to be breatharians and not able to, and not needing to eat, living off God's grace. Or levitation when meditating, things like that. They're wonderfully documented in a book called The Future of the Body by Michael Murphy, who's a co-founder of Esalen Institute. And it's an encyclopedic overview of ways to improve one's consciousness, to explore improvement. And he goes through Zen and running and athletics of various sorts and drugs and religion. One of the things he covers is the Catholic Church's semi-scientific investigation of claims of miracles from the Middle Ages, among them Entheogens, for example. And near-death experiences, famously. Identification, I thought of as a category, like this idea of human sacrifice or cannibalism, eating the consciousness, if you will, of the other organism or the other, the enemy. and ancestor worship. Again, sharing, expanding your consciousness in a sense, your definition of self to include someone or thing from a prior generation. Again, all of which points out our altered state and therefore our default state and the need to get there, to notice, and to get to something more fundamental. You know, the tribal peoples have a hard-won knowledge base of wisdom, which is instantiated in form of ritual. So it's like, you know, over the centuries, they use trial and error to accrete a body of knowledge of what works. What safety and efficacy is the Food and Drug Administration's requirement. But that's also the tribal requirement as well. Safety and efficacy. It's got to, you know, it's got to work, and it's got to not, you know, cause more harm than good. So some of these substances you wouldn't use. Pregnant women aren't allowed to use them because it's a safety thing, safe and effective. And so these things accumulate. It's kind of like, not that different from the Western, the way we do it in the scientific method, where we take several conditions, high, medium, low, a placebo perhaps, a different substance perhaps, and examine them together in a randomly selected group. And so we then see what the results are immediately. But if you think of it sort of like in a vertical way, over the centuries, you can accrete knowledge and store it in ritual, and have a hard-won body of knowledge that also builds upon comparisons, essentially, but over time. There's a chapter in my book called The 10 Lessons of Psychedelic Therapy Rediscovered, where I talk about the tribal antecedents of what we've learned here. Famously, you know, in the West, we know about set and setting. Timothy Leary's admonition, you know, to where your mind is at and where your environment is at. And then there's a drug itself, the substance, the dosage, preparation, hand-holding during, follow-up afterward. There's a bunch of things that we've now learned over the last 60 or 70 years experimenting with psychedelics. And in a sense, they're all recreations of tribal knowledge. Because the tribal people, you know, have their prep as well, which is, you know, all their lives they know what's in the plant pharmacopoeia. Or hand-holding. Well, yes, you know, your uncle is with you when you're taking your rite of passage. You're not sneaking it around the corner or hiding. So, you know, we could do worse than to actively mine tribal wisdom, tribal knowledge, tribal rituals for methodologies and lessons that we can apply in the work we're doing now in the West. And rites of passage I mentioned. So rites of passage is beautiful. Like, why would psychedelics and rites of passage be sort of associated? Well, psychedelics, you know, in psychedelic research, there are two types of research. One was psychedelic research, mostly in the sort of hard-hitting cowboy West, West meaning America, where they would try to give you one super-duper shot of LSD and change your whole life, you know, forever. But in Europe more, they had something called psycholytic psychotherapy, in which they used a smaller dose and they interspersed it with analytical, you know, psychoanalysis mostly, and expected it to not blow your mind into, you know, enlightenment, but rather make the boundary between conscious and subconscious more permeable. So you could see down into your subconscious more, and things would percolate up, like in free association during psychotherapy. So that word psycholytic is really important. Lytic means loosening. So if you think about rites of passage, why would a psychedelic that loosens things be useful in a rite of passage? Well, of course, the rite of passage is from one sort of cognitive set or sociological state of being, like from child to another, like teen, or from youth to adult, or from adult to parent, or parent to elder, those sorts of things. Those are all reconfigurations of roles. So if you think about it like a child of 8 or 10, you know, being told, all right, you know, time to be a man, you know, tomorrow. And they say, whoa, you know, or let's say you say, well, you're going to do it over time, slowly over time. And the child says, well, no, I'm getting used to this and I don't like it. I'm going to stay with mommy. But if you have a tribal, you know, a public ritual where the entire tribe's been there and it's tradition, excuse me. I'm trying to time myself as carefully as I've been timing everybody else. Otherwise, you know, I'd be a hypocrite. So let me, so indulge me. You know, but if you have a ritual where your mind is loosened up, where there's a set of, you know, drums and chanting and other things that help dislodge you from your current mind state, And then you come into a place where all the men are, in the male sense, you know, changing your small little stick for a spear that you can barely carry perhaps, but you're now surrounded by the cultural norm. So it's easier to shift, to go in this stepwise fashion through rites of passage if you can loosen it up. I'm going to move forward a little bit in this interest of time. So here's the modern perspective. Another way that you can sort of do stages like rites of passage, sort of, is Piaget's work. He's a Swiss psychologist who looked at the developmental processes in children by just observing them, and found that there were plateaus of stability that were, you know, ended by walls, if you will, of change, of requirement for change. And that once you sort of met those challenges and changed, you were then on another plateau, sort of a stepwise model of development. Each stage was relatively stable for a while. And what you see in the curve that I pulled in there was that, in a sense, it's almost like a normal distribution. So this blue curve can continue down here, the mirror image of what you see over here. And here's this sort of beginning of another normal distribution. So it's almost like a sequence of normal distributions on top of one another, bell-shaped curves. And right over here is where the action takes place. This is where, when you're doing fine as a kid in the tribe, they're asking you to now be a man. And you say, well, I don't want to be a man. It's not as effective as if I stay a child. But you know, the tribe knows that in the long run it won't work. So you have to bail to the next stage. So this developmental model of a series of mini deaths and rebirths, if you will, comes from not just rites of passage, but also from Piaget's theories. I'm going to go pretty much over the research side because you guys are also sophisticated, and besides which we've been covering it for the past couple of days. But you know, the first wave of psychedelic research talked about, you know, the relative safety. I want to talk about Gabel's table a little bit because it's instructive to look at. It's kind of like the work that we saw earlier today. But you can see that if this is, oh, sorry, bear with me. If this is dependence potential, and this is lethality, you might imagine up there is heroin. Down there, this is like David Nutt's chart. Down there is LSD and psilocybin. Interesting, marijuana's not lethal, but more addictive. And MDMA, which we think of as sort of a psychedelic, which you want to be down here, is actually over here. MDMA, mescaline, these are the phenethylamines, which are toxic in higher doses. But you know, in addition to being toxic in higher doses by neuronal dieback, there's also regrowth. And in the case of psilocybin, there's active regrowth of neurons in psilocybin medium. And not only that, but there's behavioral observation of regrowth, so to speak, or in the openness scale. The Johns Hopkins research showed that in the psychological scale on openness, which is typically shut down and frozen really at about the age of 6 or 7, reopens when these subjects go through psilocybin research. And addiction interruption is ibogaine. So the Spring Grove experiments were sort of the state of the art of the first wave of the 60s that really ended in the 70s. And they found that the peak experience, Maslow's peak experience, or ego death, samadhi, you know, white light, stage 4 psychedelic experience. If stage 1 is sensory, sexual, auditory, visual, and stage 2 is psychodynamic, and stage 3 is sort of global, Gaian, integral, holistic, then stage 4 is white light, dissociative, ego death. And that state, the 4th state, is statistically associated with outcome in the research studies. It's transformative. Now, the current research. Here's where I'm not going to tell you too much. The psilocybin cancer study, I will not go over. We've been blessed with wonderful information about that. We didn't talk too much about the MDMA PTSD work, but it is a cure, really, for PTSD. The Mythhoppers down in South Carolina are doing that work under MAPS funding. And so it's become really a beautiful horse race, a rescheduling horse race between MDMA, which is having fantastic results when added to psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, and psilocybin, which has been having wonderful results for a number of things, including end-of-life anxiety. So pretty soon, maybe 8 years, I think, depending on the numbers, we'll see those rescheduled. I talked about the 4 stages. These things create these sorts of ego-transformative experiences. In a religious setting, 90%. In a non-religious setting, Oz Janiger in LA with his psychotherapy clients, 24%. But the most important part is reintegration. You can have the most wonderful psychedelic insight, the most wonderful psychedelic experience, and then if you come back to the dirty world and give up hope of integrating the beauty and perfection you experienced into the world with your boss and your mortgage and all that stuff, then you may just close it off. And walling it off after sort of seeing it is psychically very expensive to do. You got to hide from it now. And it means that you're not going to try psychedelics again, probably, or you're going to sort of avoid the insights. So rather, integration is the most important part. And so how do you integrate? When you come back, yes, to the dirty world. Well, you take the bodhisattva model. You come in and you say, well, yes, whatever I've learned and come to, I can now bring to help for others, because really, I'm not really enlightened unless everybody is. So I think that is the key to reintegration, is realizing that, yes, things aren't perfect, and that they're not supposed to be perfect, really, and that perfection is improving, increasing perfection. So here's another concept. Otto Rank, one of Freud's disciples, came up with the concept of birth trauma. The Freudians say, well, the earlier it is, the younger you are, the more influenced you are from traumas. Well, then birth must be the most influential. So he reckoned, well, look, if you're an embryo and you're growing and sort of running out of room, you're going to feel crushed in, and there's going to be no way out. You're going to think you're going to die, and you're going to really get kind of stressed out about it, that you will die shortly. It's like ego death in psychedelics. But then a light opens at the end of the tunnel. It's the birth canal. And not only that, you know you have to go there, but you can't go there because you will die. It's too narrow. But you have to go anyway, and you know this. And besides which, you're being pushed by contractions to go anyway. So you end up going through that birth canal, and yes, there's a death and a rebirth. This concept of stage-wise, step-wise death and rebirth, this normal distribution replacing itself, is found throughout nature. All right, so I'm coming to the end. This is one of the final slides. It's actually from business. Okay, so this is Blockbuster and Netflix. All right? Now, this is Blockbuster, obviously, and this is Netflix. And here's another example. Like if you're an investor, let's say, and you were in Blockbuster, and right here, somebody from Netflix comes, come on, invest in my company. It's going to lose money at first, You'd be excused for saying, no way, I'm going to stay with this great technology, Blockbuster. But of course, the prescient will know that it's going to run out of steam and that you better bail, and it's a good deal because then you're going to do this. But then there's going to be another one that's going to replace Netflix. Oh, this is Schumpeter, by the way, a business theorist or philosopher who talked about creative destruction. You have to get rid of the old to make way for the new. Here's a bunch of examples. This one in the upper right-hand corner is the one I think I like the best because it sort of averages to a straight line going up at 45 degrees, but you can see it's not literally continuous. There's mini deaths and rebirths. So, so here we find psychedelics being an agent for observation of self, for a loosening agent, if you will, that can help you transform and change. We have this fear of annihilation. It leads to difficult, I don't want to say bad trips, because a difficult trip is one where at the end of it, you come out of it, you've learned something, you've gained ground. But when you have a bad trip and they take you to the hospital and they shoot you full of some drug that puts you to sleep, 24 hours later you wake up and you don't remember. And it's truncated and buried. So that's why at places like Burning Man you have sanctuary where it's okay, you make a safe nest, a safe container for people to have their difficult experience and not have to truncate it. And in 5 minutes or 5 seconds, the person can say, whoa, what was I into? Man, that was all about my mother. And they can continue, if you will, pick it up where they left off. So we have this desire for developmental transformation, but we have this fear as well. And part of it is because we don't have a tradition, a tribal tradition, that makes it okay, that explains why, a cosmology. But I want to point out that it's this, sorry. Okay. So good timing. I want to point out that it's this, pardon me, that it's this, that the true nature of psychedelics to me is not so much, the colors or wackiness or confusion or even anxiety. People feel that, you take a psychedelic and you're in for a wild ride. But I don't really see it that way so much. Those things, like even visual distortions and colors and hallucinations and stuff, to me are like a reaction to the action of psychedelics. And that the true action of psychedelics is to illuminate. I think of it like as the miner's helmet, with the lamp on the forehead, that wherever you look is illuminated. So, if you look at the outside world, you see it more clearly. You look at your hand, you say, wow, evolution, what a concept. Or if you introspect, if you look in the gut, you will see illuminated the cartography of your soul. Your current mind, your psychology, tectonic plates, and maybe, if you're lucky, the ground of your being at the very bottom. So that's the action, the illumination of self, let's just say. And that the crazy symptoms, what we characterize as the action of psychedelics, are actually a reaction to the action of psychedelics. So this is the true action of psychedelics, and I think their greatest benefit to society. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Thank you. So Q&A. I guess we're going to do it like we did before.
Do you have any questions on this side?
Do you want to?
Who's got a question? All right, we're going to walk all the way to the top. These guys usually get no love during the Q&A. People way up here in the nosebleeds. Today is your lucky day, sir. Who is the furthest back person in this auditorium that wants to ask a question?
We have one right here, Kevin.
We got one all the way up there. Let's do it.
I doubt I'm the furthest one from anything, really. But how about I'll start and then you find the furthest one, right? So my question is about... Sure, I don't mind. Ontology, I suppose. I thought you were going to go into it on the one slide, and I guess you had to kind of move quickly. You talked a little bit about the netherworld, or examples of it, outward examples of it in the history of humanity, and it immediately struck me that maybe we have this netherworld that we call the internet, or network protocols, cryptography, and such. So I guess I'm wondering, about the ontos of the internet to you. Is the internet alive, or is it dead? What is the internet, and what are these things to us in the context of the ontology of today?
Wow. Well, I love that question. I think there's different ways, there's different levels at which to answer that question. On the broadest level, technology and animals and life on Earth and all that we've done are all one integrated weave or web. And so very, very real and not really all that separated from one another. That, it's sort of a continuity that technology and humans, for example, on Earth, co-evolve. So, that's at the broadest level. We're all one. After all, the entire universe as a whole, the Gestalt universe, is what we refer to as God. And, the emergent properties of that Gestalt universe are what we refer to as miracles. So it's all one thing. So, hello, God, we're all God. And so are you, and so is the technology in that sense, one whole thing. In a sort of more, like earthbound plane, to answer that question. I think of the technology as being sort of a medium or a enabling environment for evolution, for integration. The famous Borg from Star Trek, is demonized, but in fact, I think that's kind of what the history of the evolution of life kind of shows, that things go toward greater levels of organization, in a stepwise fashion, by the way. In a stepwise fashion. So there'll be some, conflict of H and O, and then a miracle will happen and you'll have H2O. And there'll be some difficulty with molecules and a miracle will happen. Not a miracle, but some reconfiguration, some reintegration at a higher level of complexity will happen, and then you'll have a molecule, or DNA, or human organisms, or collective operations like tribes. I mean, no individual could ever have built the George Washington Bridge, because it would entail, bringing oil from the Mideast and building roads. And so no individual could do that. Only at the collective level could we do that. So things get more efficient, as you go up. The guy named, it's in my earlier slide, who's an evolutionary biologist, Stuart Kaufman, who wrote about the origins of order and talked about how more complicated configurations are actually energy efficient at the molecular level as well as at the societal level. And that's why organization tumbles kind of upward into greater complexity. And the internet is a good example of that, I think. So, so in that sense, then, we're just going to be cells in the larger organism, of the global mind of humanity. And I think that's inevitable, and we can benefit from it, but we want to retain our humanity at the same time. So that's my sort of take on the internet. Another question?
We have a question up here, 5 rows from the top, probably the highest question we've gotten today.
Hi.
Hi.
Speaking a little bit off the back of yesterday's panel on using psychedelics to transition in death, speaking briefly with Professor Reed about what if we're to integrate psychedelics and transition into death in such a way that it works so well that we're ready to die sooner? I'm wondering, do you think that could be a thing? / how might that affect population, and how might it affect how we're introducing psychedelics to kids? If we're all like, hey, psychedelics is a really easy way to get over your fear of death, we're all gonna die. I mean, that's, just in a positive way. But so, do you have anything to say in that regard?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not fear of death that, is keeping us, is the only thing that's keeping us from dying. I mean, because if you remove fear of death, if you had a holistic, healthy, kind of quote-unquote positive, sort of positive, if you will, attitude toward death, it still wouldn't mean that you'd go want to do it. I mean, positive attitude toward death when it inevitably comes, taking it healthfully and appropriately, accepting it fully, even lovingly, is not the same thing as approaching it or wanting it or trying to achieve it sooner. So, I think that psychedelics would help us have a more healthy, realistic, naturalistic, if you will, mature, if you will, aware attitude toward death, rather than one that, that would mean we'd want to avoid it, appropriately, healthfully, as long as possible, and live our lives fully. So, I don't think it would cause a problem with dipping population or thanatology or stuff like that, except maybe an assisted suicide, but that would be, within that context, a positive thing as well.
I get another question up in the nosebleeds.
Great.
Hey there.
Hi.
I have a question about your therapy practice.
Sure.
I'm curious if you have experience working with people in underserved communities and people who've struggled with addiction, poverty, and how this whole process has worked in cases like that, and what you think the potential is in real terms to, and obviously this relates to policy as well, but to connect with people in underserved communities in America.
Well, it's funny. We're a capitalist society, and I make a living, from my psychotherapy. And it's a question that I raise because it's, I like to think that I bring people joy and peace and love and beautiful things that aren't really measured financially, but yet it is a business as well. So the way I handle that is I try to have this is my personal thing. It's not like the way it needs to be policy-wise, but I try to have one pro bono client who I treat for free, and I also have a sliding scale. And it's worked out, well. I mean, the sliding scale, basically, it's simple, but it's, I have my full price and then my starving artist price, which is 25% off. And then my kind of like, you're not employed and you're maybe on welfare or whatnot, and that's 50% off. So I have that. But then again, what about somebody who's, homeless or on the streets? That person doesn't come into my world so much, and it's a problem. Those people have difficulty. I interact with folks who can't afford my services, and so I try to adjust for them and then try to help them out in various ways. But it is a difficulty. It's the same. It's a related question which I'll raise about using psychedelics in my practice, which I don't do, by the way. I don't do psychedelic therapy. And I'm not just saying that, because I'm speaking publicly now. I actually don't do it because I couldn't speak publicly and write a book and have a secret practice because I figure I'm too wimpy. I figured I'd get busted eventually. But nonetheless, it's an ethical problem. It's a similar, kind of related ethical problem. It's an underserved population in the sense of underserved with psychedelics. And so how do you, when you have a client who you feel really needs it or would benefit from it, how do I deal with that ethically? And over the years, I've become more and more uncomfortable with that problem. And so, because I wrote Psychedelic Healing, I get lots of people come to me about the book, and I can't give them psychedelics, or, offer them psychedelic therapy. But I do say that if you take psychedelics, I'm obviously enthusiastic about that as a process. So, take your psychedelic on a Wednesday, see me on a Thursday. Or take your psychedelic on a Thursday and see me on a Friday. And so, one last thing. The idea of dealing with people who have drug addiction, let me check my timing here. Ooh, I'm basically done. Drugs are really difficult to deal with in psychotherapeutic practice. And that's where I really wish that I had, that I could use psychedelics. Because alcohol addiction, people are inuring themselves, are treating themselves, are wanting to avoid pain, not open up to see, the history so much. And so, psychedelics are an invaluable tool. And in the 60s, when they did this research, they found it, incredibly helpful with alcoholism and other drugs. So for me, it's like, as a psychologist, dealing with somebody who has a drug protection, if you will, it's like taking a pickaxe to, like a concrete, well, and having, it be like sparks and little pebbles coming off, and having to go down to the bottom of this concrete well 30 feet down. You say, well, yeah, give me 30 years and, we'll get through this. So psychedelics loosens it up and makes it transparent and opens it up, and you can see down to the bottom of your well more readily. So that's why I'm doing this, and that's why I'm enthusiastic, and that's why I appreciate all you guys coming out and supporting psychedelics. And although we're not associated with MAPS in any way, I want to encourage you to join maps.org. It's $35 a year. It supports the research, and you'll be knowledgeable too, and it's a good thing to do. So anyway, thank you very much, you guys.
And thank you, Neal Goldsmith.